This is the Olympus M.Zuiko 14-42mm F3.5-F5.6 electronic zoom lens with the model number EZ-M1442-3 R. It was announced in January 2014 and it weighs 93 grams and is 2.25 centimeters when retracted. So once the lens opens up, then it becomes a lot longer, obviously. There are two lens caps for this lens. One is the LC-37B, which is a regular lens cap, and then the other one is the automatic lens cap, which is the LC-37C, and that's the one that I have attached here. This one attaches to the filter thread of this lens, and the filter thread on this lens is 37mm, and I think the best use for the filter thread is to use it with this automatic lens cap. So if I turn on the camera, you can see that the lens cap gets removed automatically, and if I shut down the camera, the lens cap closes automatically. So I think this is really convenient if you just want a small camera and a lens and you're not too bothered about what you're using. Convenience is the most important thing. Then this lens and this lens cap is really practical for use because you just take out the camera, turn it on, and take pictures or videos. So this lens has 5 aperture blades and a diagonal angle of view of 75 degrees. So 75 degrees at its widest and 29 degrees at the narrowest end. So the closest focusing distance for this lens is 20 centimeters at the widest and 25 centimeters at the narrowest. The lens has a really thin focusing ring. So as you can see here, this is the focus ring, which I'm turning now, and the one back here is the zoom ring. So the zoom ring doesn't actually rotate fully. It's more like a lever that you press or you push in one direction and it zooms in and out. So let me just demonstrate that. I don't actually rotate the zoom ring, I just push it in one direction or the other one. So as you can see, the zoom ring doesn't rotate. But the focus ring in the front, the really thin one here, that does rotate, and it's an electronic focus ring. So one of the advantages of this electronic zoom lens is that you can use it like a PTZ for pan tilt zoom. Obviously you can't do the pan and tilt, but you can do the zooming in and out. So if you've set it up at a remote location and you're using software to control the camera or this lens on a camera which supports that functionality, then this lens is really useful for that. So in terms of disadvantages, in my opinion, this lens isn't wide enough, so I would prefer it to go to 12mm, whereas 14mm is the widest that it goes. Although, I mean, this is not really a disadvantage, it's just the nature of the lens. But I find it more practical to have lenses that go down to 12mm for everyday video shooting. But I think for photography it might be different, because if you're taking photographs, for example, if you're doing street photography or a lot of different types of photography, then the 14+ range would be more useful. And the other thing I would say is that this lens isn't really sharp. So for example, there's a M.Zuiko Pro lens, which is 12-45. That one is obviously bigger and heavier, but that one is really sharp. So when I compare the 14-42 to the 12-45, there's a big difference going between this lens and this lens in terms of sharpness and image quality. Obviously that's a Pro lens, so I don't think they're in the same price category or size category, but I thought I just mentioned that in case someone doesn't want to go with a small lens from the beginning. They know that there are options there that are slightly bigger, but it will actually produce a much better image quality. And the main advantages of this lens is that it's really small, really light, and it has an automatic lens cap. I think this is really practical to use, and the electronic zoom can also be used when you're using it on a pan tilt zoom camera. So as a small and light lens, I think this is probably one of the best, if not the best, pancake zoom lenses that exist on Micro Four Thirds. There's another pancake lens that Lumix has produced, and that one's quite good as well. So I'm not sure which one I would pick between this one and that one. And the pancake lens on Lumix is the 12-32. So it goes a bit wider, but then in the telephoto end, it stops at 32. So that one also has really good image quality, but that one does have some other shortcomings. So to compare this lens, the closest comparison is another lens with almost the same exact spec as this one, which is the 14-42mm F3.5-F5.6 Mark II R. So these two lenses have the same focal length and the same aperture, and everything about them is almost identical, but there are a few small differences. So one of the differences is that this one doesn't have an electronic zoom, so it has this lever. You unlock the lens and then you have a manual zoom. So what this manual zoom means in terms of usage is that it's actually easier to zoom in and out, and it also has a wider focus ring. So in terms of focusing and zooming in and out, this lens is definitely better than this lens because it has bigger rings and it's manual. So it's a mechanical movement of the lens that you're controlling. Whereas on this one, the zoom is electronic. So you're just pushing a lever, which makes the camera move, and also it doesn't feel good and it's difficult to operate. And then the focus ring on this one is wider as well. So if you're doing video work, I would definitely say this one with the letter R at the end of it is a better lens to go for. But if you want compactness, then this one is better. So one of the disadvantages of having the mechanical zoom ring is that you can't use it as a PTZ lens because you can't zoom in and out remotely. But for video recording, when you're doing handheld work, this one is obviously much nicer to work with. So this one weighs 113 grams, which is slightly heavier than this one at 93 grams. And this one length is 5 centimeters when it's retracted. So if I retract this all the way, it's 5 centimeters. So this one is obviously substantially bigger, which is why it can have the bigger focus ring and the bigger zoom ring as well. And this one doesn't have a automatic lens cap. So you just have the normal lens cap, which you open up and close. But one of the advantages of this one is that it has a lens hood thread. So you can attach one of these plastic lens hoods to it. And you can take it off. So this is something that you don't have on the other lens. And one more advantage of this bigger lens is that it has 7 aperture blades, whereas the one with the electronic zoom has 5 aperture blades. So the background blur and the bokeh will look better on this one. And in terms of the closest focusing distance, the closest focusing distance on this one is 5 centimeters more than the closest focusing distance on the electronic zoom lens. So this one is 25 centimeters at its widest and 30 centimeters at its narrowest. Whereas the electronic zoom is 20 centimeters and 25 centimeters at the widest and narrowest. So just to summarize, marginally heavier, slightly bigger, manual focus ring, manual zoom ring, bigger focus ring, no automatic lens cap, has a lens hood thread with a lens hood, has 7 aperture blades for better background blur and bokeh, and has a further closest focusing distance. So depending on what you're looking for, one or the other one might be better. If you want small size or remote connectivity or close focusing distance, then this one is better. If you want handheld video work and better background blur and bokeh, and control over this, then this one is better. Another lens to compare this to, which I don't have, is the Panasonic Lumix 14-42mm F3.5-F5.6 power zoom. So that lens is almost identical to this one in the sense that it has a power zoom, so the same thing that Olympus calls electronic zoom, and it has the same focal range and the same aperture, and it weighs 95 grams, which is almost identical to this one, and its thickness is 2.7 centimeters or 2.68 centimeters to be exact, which is very close to this one, as this one is 2.25 centimeters. So they have the same maximum aperture, the same closest focusing distance, the same filter size at 37 millimeters. But the one thing about the Panasonic one is that it doesn't have a focus ring. It has a focus lever instead. So in that sense, this one is better because it has a focus ring, which is easier to work with. And that one has an electronic zoom lever. So instead of having a zoom ring, that one has a zoom lever. So the one thing I would say about the zoom ring on this, it's not a proper ring because you can't turn it and it has resistance like a spring. So this one is almost like a lever as well, even though it doesn't look like a lever. It looks like a ring, but it's not exactly a ring because you can't rotate it. And the Panasonic Lumix one has optical stabilization, but the optical stabilization will only work on Panasonic cameras, not on Olympus cameras. So if you like to buy Panasonic lenses, then that one is pretty much the equivalent of this lens. Slightly bigger, marginally heavier, but overall is pretty much the same. And it gives you optical stabilization as well, as long as it's on a Panasonic camera. But it doesn't have a focus ring and some minor differences in terms of rings and levers to control it with. So there's really no real distinction between these two lenses. And if you're concerned about the optical stabilization, I would say the sensor stabilization on Olympus cameras are so good that they make up more than any optical stabilization that you would get on that lens. So if that's a concern for you, I would say don't even think about it. Just go with the Olympus lens. But if you have a Panasonic camera and you're used to buying Panasonic lenses, then maybe go for the Panasonic lens. But I prefer the Olympus one. It seems to be a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, and the image quality might be marginally better, but it's really difficult to tell whether it is better or not, but if it is, it would be marginally. And there's another Panasonic Lumix lens, which is again a pancake zoom lens, but the range for that is between 12 to 32, and the aperture is f3.5 to f5.6. And that one also has optical stabilization, and the optical stabilization again only works on Panasonic cameras. But with that one of the advantages it has is, first of all, it's lighter than this one, so that one is 70 grams, and the thickness is 2.4 centimeters, so it's closer to this one. It's slightly bigger, but still closer to the Olympus one. And in terms of closest focusing distance, it's the same as this one, 20 centimeters, same filter size at 37 millimeters. And it does have a manual zoom ring, but it doesn't have a focus ring. So if you want to focus manually, you have to do it on the camera slider or just switch to autofocus, which is what I recommend you would do on that lens. And the optical stabilization doesn't have an on-off switch, so you can just configure it inside the camera. But the one thing I would say about that lens is that it's actually sharper than both the Olympus 14-42 and the Panasonic 14-42. So it's sharper and it has a wider angle of view at the 12mm focal length, and it's also lighter than both the Olympus and the Panasonic Lumix lens. So I would say that's a really good lens to consider because of its lighter weight as well as the higher image quality. But it does have some peculiarities as well, in the sense that it doesn't have a focus ring and it has a manual zoom ring. So if your intention was to use this as a PTZ lens, then the Olympus one is better because it has electronic zoom, whereas with the 12 to 32 Lumix lens, that one doesn't have electronic zoom, so it's a manual zoom ring. So if you're carrying it in your hand and using your hand to operate it, then I would say the Panasonic Lumix one is better. But if you want to use it as a PTZ lens and use it remotely, then the Olympus 14-42 or the Panasonic Lumix 14-42 power zoom are better for that, because you just leave them somewhere and you can zoom in and out, which you can't do with the 12 to 32mm Lumix lens. So again, there's no real better lens or worse lens. It just depends on how you want to use it, whether you want to use it in your hand or remotely, or how much weight and size matters to you, or whether the focal length matters to you. So those are the things that you have to consider yourself and decide which lens is the best one for you. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens, or if you want me to go into more detail about any particular functionality of this lens, or if you want me to compare it to any other lens. This is the Olympus LC-37C lens cap, which is compatible with the Olympus M.Zuiko 14-42mm F3.5-5.6 electronic zoom lens. So that's the pancake lens, not the other one, which is slightly bigger. And essentially what this lens cap does is that it automatically closes and opens once you turn on or switch off the camera. So when you turn on the camera, it automatically opens the lens cap, and when you switch off the camera, it automatically closes the lens cap. So it's a lot like a point and shoot camera in that sense. So once you attach this to your lens, the camera is effectively a point and shoot. You just take it out, turn on the camera, and you're ready to shoot. You don't have to take off the lens cap or anything like that. I'm gonna unbox it quickly and then attach it to a camera so that you can see how it works in practice. And the way this automatic lens cap works is that there's a lever, and if you push that lever, it closes the lens cap. So what happens when the electronic zoom lens closes, it pushes against that lever and it closes the lens cap. So the lens cap doesn't actually use any form of electronics or any electrical current or circuit, so it's not going to reduce the battery life of the camera. It's just a mechanical spring that gets pushed and closes the lens cap. And the lens cap weighs around 9 grams or maybe 10 grams, so it's very light as well. And it's made in Vietnam. So I'm gonna attach it to the Olympus OMD EM10 Mark IV just as a demonstration. And the lens cap I'm taking off here is the Olympus LC-37B, which is the
regular lens cap that you get for 37mm lenses. And the lens cap I'm attaching now is the LC-37C, which is the automatic lens cap. So just a reminder for when attaching this lens cap is to extend the lens first before trying to attach it. Otherwise you need to press down on the lever while simultaneously turning the lens cap in order to install it. And there you can see when I switch off the camera, the lens cap closes, and when I turn it on, the lens cap opens, and it's all a mechanical feature, so there's no electronics involved in this. So this lens cap screws onto the filter thread of this lens, and the filter thread for this lens is 37mm. So this lens doesn't have an option for a lens hood thread. It just has a filter thread, and that's what we're using for the lens cap in this case. So that means you can't attach a filter to the filter thread now that we have this lens cap on. I don't think anyone would be using a filter with this type of lens anyway, but in my opinion, the lens cap being automatic is more useful than a filter in most cases for this camera and this type of shooting anyway.